Well, good afternoon. My name is James Stoner. I'm professor of political science at Louisiana State University, and this year I'm privileged to be Garwood visiting professor in the James Madison program here at Princeton. And it's my special privilege this afternoon to be able to introduce to you Roger Scruton, who is a visiting professor of philosophy at St. Andrews University and at Oxford, and a senior fellow of the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. Dr. Scruton is a longtime writer and philosopher, well known on both sides of the Atlantic. He's held teaching positions before here at Princeton, at Boston University, and at Birkbeck College in London. He's the author of many, many books. I think my favorite is your little book on beauty the other year, which I heartily recommend to you, but he's probably written 2 or 3 more books on that subject even since then, and author or composer as well as of an opera, as you've heard before, and for many years was editor of the Salisbury Review. He earned his degrees, BA, MA, and PhD, or at least that's what it says here, although I don't think those are the names in England, at the University of Cambridge, and has a law degree from the Inner Temple in London. He's given a series of 3 lectures, the Charles Test lectures here, and this is the 3rd. And today we'll be able to really get him, because of course any of you who've been to the previous 2 lectures know that he's always been able to answer questions or deflect questions by saying, well, tomorrow or in the next lecture, I do plan to raise that topic or treat that topic. So I will get quiet very soon so we can have plenty of time for discussion. And for those of you who are here for the first time, you're in for a treat as Roger Scruton speaks today, having spoken about human nature and human rights, today about human duties. I give you Roger Scruton.
Thank you very much. There we are. I'm going to talk about human duties today, but just before beginning, just to resume what I have said up to now. I began by giving not exactly a theory of human nature, but a perspective on human nature, which began by emphasizing the relation between I and you, the interpersonal relation in which we instinctively hold each other to account for what we are, for what we feel, what we think, and what we intend. And from that, I try to build up a picture of the way in which the world in which we humans exist is transfigured by that relation, which is our apprenticeship in being, so to speak, and as a result transformed so that the world in which we live is in some sense not identical with the world of nature, but a kind of appearance spread over it. And from that account of human nature, I argued that it is part of our nature to live with each other through a calculus of rights and duties, and responsibilities and so on, through which we negotiate the boundary between us and create around each other the space in which we can live as individuals in a sovereign realm of our own. And that has been built in since the Enlightenment into our conception of political order and has made human rights into a fundamental item of not just of our political belief, but of the way in which we construct our political institutions. But as I also argued last time, this calculus of rights and duties does not suffice to exhaust all the duties that we have, and the concept of a right is also open to radical abuse when we confuse freedom rights with claim rights, as we have a tendency to do in order to achieve political objectives which, as it were, lie outside the a priori structure of our practical reasoning. So this has left me with this principal leftover topic, which is the topic of duty, and obviously I should begin by recognizing that duties are not simply the antithesis of rights. We have duties, or we owe things to each other. I owe things to you. we owe things to you, I owe things to us, etc., he to she, and he to her, and all the rest. So there's a web of duties which bind us all, not just as first person singular, but also in first person plural and second person singular, and so on. This web of duties is often people try to understand it in terms of the social contract, relying on a principle which I attribute to Hobbes. This is his language in Leviathan. Hobbes argues that there is no obligation on a man that ariseth not from some act of his own. Okay, so if you're obliged in any way towards another or towards a group or towards a community, it's because you've done something to incur this obligation. The obvious example being a promise or a contract in which you undertake an obligation explicitly, and then you are honour bound or duty bound, as we say, to fulfil that. But is this always so? Obviously, this is so in the primary cases of undertaking obligations. And I think I've referred to him already, but I think he's an important thinker in this area, John Searle, who has written extensively on what goes on when we undertake obligations. Some people would say too extensively, because after all, he did it in one book, and then 10 books is saying the same thing is probably too many. However, what he had to say was really important, and he's right that promising is also an undertaking of an obligation. But it's not only promising that does that, that has this character. We can create expectations in a way which, if we're sufficiently conscious of what we're doing, also amounts to a tacit undertaking of an obligation. We can form agreements which are not explicitly stated, but nevertheless are, as it were, implicit in our mutual behaviour, which involve undertaking obligations. And again, there are obligations that exist in the interstices of social life, and which create what Searle calls deontic powers. Let's say powers of duty and right and so on, which exist, as it were, in the air we breathe. That they are realities, social realities, which exist outside us, but on which we depend for many of our transactions. The dollar bill, for instance, it is a crystallization of a whole sequence of obligations undertaken by government to maintain its value and to honour it as an item of exchange, to give it to maintain it in legal currency and so on. The pound note in my childhood in England used to have a little inscription signed by the governor of the Bank of England saying, "I promise to pay the bearer on demand £1." Nobody at that time knew what that meant. Originally it had meant a pound of gold, which of course is absurd now. And indeed the only measure of what a pound is the pound note. So it was an empty promise, if you like, or a self-reflective promise, but it was a way of pointing out that currency only has value because it is stands proxy for a web of promises which we don't necessarily know how to state. Likewise, the green light which you drive through on the road is a kind of expression of an obligation on the part of the state to allow you through there and not to prosecute you for going across the junction, etc. There are all kinds of ways in which permissions are issued to us with the authority of the powers that be without there being any explicit statement of them. Every time there is a legal judgment in favour of one of the parties, this is also backed up by the deontic powers of the court, the power to enforce that judgment and the promise that it will be enforced, the obligation to do that and so on. So it's quite clear that our social world is transformed by our ability to undertake and honour obligations, and they are all around us, hidden in the interstices of social life, and all in many ways, most of them seeming to be reducible to this idea of the promise, the undertaking of an obligation. If that were so, then Hobbes's principle would have a certain authority. However, I want to point out, and I have already pointed out along the way, that there are other obligations that are very difficult to assimilate to this model. There are obligations of gratitude. You know, if your parents have looked after you up to now, and thanks to them you have been able to emerge into the human world a fully equipped adult, and if you're a decent person, you'll feel grateful to them. But there was no undertaking of an obligation that founds this obligation of gratitude. This is there in the structure of the relation. It's right for you to feel gratitude, and indeed you're obliged to express that gratitude. And likewise, obligations of piety, when people feel that they must honour the dead, or honour or attend a particular ceremony, or take part in some particular activity, because that is what is done, and that is the way of affirming your membership of a community. That's not again, it's not an obligation that you've ever undertaken, but it lies upon you, so to speak, as an obligation of piety. And obligations to the dead and the unborn, likewise, again, of course, we can't exactly undertake obligations to the dead once they're dead, although we do have them, as I argued last time. And similarly with the unborn, we don't undertake the obligation by promising directly to them, although in a way we can make vows to act in such a way that the unborn will benefit from our behaviour. But I think, again, it's necessary to distinguish a promise from a vow. A promise has a specific content, so to speak. I promise to do this. I promise to bring a bottle of wine this evening to the dinner. And that promise can be fulfilled, and when it's fulfilled, the obligation ends. Vows are not like that. They're more existential. They involve a commitment which is, as it were, for unspecifiable actions, undelimited actions. And obviously the classic example being the vow of marriage, which isn't a finite promise to do this or be that. It's an existential joining of one person to another, the duties of which are inexhaustible and unspecifiable in advance. So, and our duties towards the unborn are more like that. We also have obligations to the community in which we live, to the nation to which we belong, and these are controversial areas, of course, because some people argue that it's only some communities that create obligations in their members, and that there are wrong forms of community from which we should free ourselves, etc. And then we have, finally, obligations to strangers, people to whom we've never undertaken any obligation because we don't know them. And that's something I'm going to come on to in a minute. But first, I just want to say a few things about political obligation, because this is a special case about which a great deal has been said, much more than has been said about all the other examples I've mentioned. Hobbes's principle that there is no obligation upon a man that ariseth not from an action of his own, that principle he states in the Leviathan by way of introducing the social contract. He says that in that case, if there is to be an obligation to obey the law or to obey the sovereign, there must be some undertaking of this obligation, some act whereby we concede that we are under this obligation. And the obvious example would be a contract. That is the primary example in human life in which people do, through an act of their own, undertake an obligation. So he thinks that the social contract is then the foundation of all the obligations of political life. And that idea, as all the political scientists in this room will know, has had a long history both before Hobbes and afterwards. But I've never been persuaded that it is a complete account of political obligation. In any of its forms, the social contract, because it seems to me that a social contract always presupposes a relation of membership between the people undertaking it. If we are gathered together to form a contract for future government. And then there is a supposition that we already belong together. We make a distinction between those who are part of this deal and those who are not part of this deal, the deal. It's not a deal that is made between all people everywhere, after all. There is a finite boundary around the community which is undertaking to live together on these terms. And the contract in that way presupposes a first-person plural and does not create it. And this is very obvious from the American Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution too, which refers to we, the people, as the creators of this entity. We're the people who are declaring that this is how we will be ruled and governed henceforth. The answer that naturally raises the question: okay, who is we? Am I included in it? Of course, I'm not. I'm British, but all Americans are included in it. And what gives them that right of membership? It isn't that they've signed the social contract, because they had that right of membership before the contract was even thought of. So this contract presupposes a kind of first-person plural, which it doesn't create. And this relation of membership creates, in turn, obligations which are both unchosen and transgenerational. I think this is the crucial thing. A social contract, insofar as it takes the form that Hobbes is thinking about, is a relation between living people who are able to actually lay down the terms and subscribe to them. But societies are not composed only of living people. That has been a theme of both the previous lectures. And I think it's the all-important observation made by Burke. The societies are composed of living people as well as dead people and unborn people. And so, in a sense, the contractual idea has to be replaced by something more in the nature of a trust. What we're doing, what we do through our political obligation, is sign up to the relation of trust, which gives us an obligation both towards those who came before us and those who come after us, to maintain in being a particular system of institutions and social order. So our membership, in other words, imposes upon us obligations, many of which are unchosen, in just the way that you didn't choose to be a citizen of this country when you were born into it. And that unchosen obligation is something that is very difficult to release, to relinquish, especially when there's an emergency and you're called up to fight in the national army. So, again, I think we have to recognize in all mature political orders that there is not just one kind of political obligation, that there are all kinds of political obligations that arise in different contexts. And in any social order, any political order, we must make a distinction, which Hegel put at the forefront of his discussion of this, between family, civil society, and the state. Each creates a sphere of obligation which is of a radically different character from the other spheres. In the family, obligations are obligations of kinship and gratitude and piety, obligations which are not undertaken because they lie in the nature of the attachments concerned. In civil society, however, our obligations are largely freely chosen. This is the arena of social choice, the arena in which the natural condition is one of contractual agreement. And that's how institutions arise. In the state, however, Hegel pointed out, and I think he's right, again, we're in a sphere where obligations are not all chosen. You are born into your nationality and your allegiance to the state that is yours, and it calls upon you, especially in times of emergency, in ways which don't presuppose any undertaken obligation. So these spheres of obligation are all of a different character, and they are all perhaps mutually necessary to maintain a political order in being. Now here I think I'm moving on. We have to distinguish different ways in which a political community can conceive of the bonds between its members. We could conceive of it as we do in terms of citizenship. This is the idea arising from the Greek city-state, according to which our membership of the community is not one of, like the membership of a family, it's not a relation of kinship, but it's a relation between potential strangers who are bound to each other by a shared jurisdiction, a shared system of law, and a shared obedience to the state which enforces it. So citizenship is something that we tend to think of as the natural form of political order. In tribal societies, however, there's a fiction of kinship. In the traditional Islamic society, there is also the idea of submission as the ultimate bond between the members of it. And I think these three ways of conceiving political order are radically different and perhaps in potential conflict with each other. Our society of strangers that we live in is one in which citizenship is defined in terms of territory. There's a territorial loyalty that binds all Americans. They are all members of a nation-state defined by its boundaries who have a duty to defend those boundaries and to obey the law within them. The law of this country is the law of the land. It's not like a religious law, which is the law of the religious community. It's the law that pertains here, and that's the thing that defines your ultimate obligation. So a society of strangers seems to require something like a territorial loyalty, and this is where we find ourselves, I think, today in a very difficult area. We recognize that our legal obligations arise through the process whereby laws are reformed and produced, and this process is complex. There is legislation which comes brought into being by Congress. There is the common law, which I have been defending as a kind of paradigm of natural practical reasoning, which comes into being through the courts. And then there's various delegated powers. There are various bureaucracies in our modern societies which have the ability to make laws which can be challenged, but which, if not challenged, have the force of legislation without being fully endorsed by Congress, as they would have to be if they were challenged. All those sources of law we recognise. We recognise that they are that we are obliged to obey those laws so made, and all of them seem to imply that we, human beings, have the ability to make law for ourselves. And maybe, if we are Democrats, we think that this ability must be subject to the rule that we ourselves have in some sense consented to the process whereby the laws are made. I think that's the natural response of people in this community to all laws, is that they must ultimately reflect the consent of the people to be governed by them. But they are made by the people and for the people. And that's totally different from the conception of law which we find in religious societies, in particular the traditional Islamic law. And I want to say a little bit about this because I think it's vital for us today if we are to understand where our duties come from. Okay, so all societies governed by religious law have the great problem: can human beings make law that overrides the revealed law? Traditionally, Islamic law is supposed to have been revealed in the Quran and in the life of the Prophet. It can be adjusted through various processes of analogy and consensus, but nevertheless, its fundamental core is of a revealed law that God has laid down as a set of duties, rather than specifying any rights. And this created an enormous problem, of course, for those people living within the jurisdiction who are not Muslims, the people called dhimmi. That word means people who are treated as through a treaty, who are treated by treaty. There's a treaty with the people of the book to acknowledge their right to be within the jurisdiction and to follow their own customs, provided they don't do various things. And Islamic law during the early years of its authority developed radically through four different schools of jurisprudence up to a certain point, through a practice which was known as ijtihad, the same word as jihad, the struggle to get things right. But at a certain stage it was declared that this had gone on too long, the gate of ijtihad is closed, no more can we revise the law or find a new interpretation of it. It is now settled for all time, because after all it is the eternal law of God. So it can no longer adjust. And this, I think, leads to a huge problem. We believe that our fundamental loyalty is to the country in which of which we are members, the country which defines our citizenship, so that territory is all important for us. That's what defines the validity of the jurisdiction. Anybody within that territory can claim the rights and also must be subject to the duties of the law that prevails there. And this comes out of the old Greek idea of the city-state. The city is the thing that lays down the law for those people residing within its boundaries. But in our time, the awakening of consciousness in the Islamic countries, in particular in Egypt, has led to people thinking that is an illegitimate way of creating a system of law. Law is not attached to territory, it's not man-made, it's laid down by God for the government of his community. And Sayyid Qutb, who was the main theorist of the Muslim Brotherhood, wrote extensively in order to defend the view that law should be considered, as it traditionally had been in Islamic jurisprudence, as laid down by God and applied to those who have submitted to God's rule. And this meant that he rejected the secular state as a kind of blasphemy, and in particular the nation state, the state defined by its boundaries, as a false form of jurisdiction. Jurisdiction was defined by the beliefs of the community rather than the place where they are. And I think that's where we find ourselves today in Egypt, where the Muslim Brotherhood, for whom Sayyid Qutb was speaking at the time, wishes to return to the Islamic conception and rule the country by Islamic law. But of course, the law itself doesn't regard the country as the defining the jurisdiction. And there's a huge problem as to what you do with Egyptians who happen not to be Muslims, like the Copts or the atheists among them and so on. So that I think this underlies much of the crisis that we see happening in that part of the world today. We, whose primary attachment is to the nation state, have no trouble conceiving law as man-made, and also as thinking that man-made law takes precedence over religious law when they conflict. It must do if there's more than one religion within the boundaries of the nation state. So for us, it's perfectly easy to accept freedom of religion as a right, a constitutional right, or to accept that religion itself should be privatized and removed from the public sphere. But it's much harder to do that in a place like Egypt. And once one has accepted that the primary source of law is divine revelation, it's very obvious, isn't it, that law then becomes very difficult to change. It's as law becomes eternal in just the way that God is eternal. So how can we, human beings, change that law in order to adapt it to our changing circumstances? Law becomes irreversible. And I think this is a real difficulty that we are now seeing in that part of the world, the irreversible edicts, which ought to be changed if people are to adapt to the modern world. Interestingly enough, we in Europe are in the same position. Although most people in America don't realize this, the European Union arose out of a treaty signed in 1957, according to which the basic structure, legislative structure of the of the Union was settled for all time. A treaty is like God in that it's there until you repudiate it. So it acts as a kind of eternal voice in the background of all our law, saying that this you can't change. Included in that treaty, for instance, was the provision that there should be freedom of movement of labour within the European countries of the Union. At the time, only 4 countries signed it, and they had the same standard of living. Nobody particularly wanted to move across borders. It didn't seem particularly interesting. But now, of course, when the former communist states of Eastern Europe have joined, there is every reason for entire populations to move out of Poland into London. And normally you'd say, well, look, this is a business for Parliament to settle. We should ask ourselves whether this is right or wrong, whether our country can survive this kind of pressure on its infrastructure, whether there is room for these people to live. But of course we can't. This has been laid down eternally by the treaty, and so our law too is unadaptable in something like the way the law in the Middle East is unadaptable, well, would be unadaptable if the Muslim Brotherhood had their way. Right, I'll just skip the subject of human rights a moment. We'll come back to that. That was all by way of saying that if we're to have the kind of jurisdiction that we think we have, the jurisdiction in which we can make and change the law for ourselves, in which the law is the product of our own consent to it, if we're to have that kind of political order, then it can't be one that is laid down by divine legislation. And it must be one which ultimately depends upon the nation state, upon this loyalty to a particular territory, this territory that is going to define who is entitled to protection and who is not. And this is something, again, which is controversial, but it seems to me to be, in the end, something we have to accept. The nation state, in some form or another, is a precondition of the liberal social order, liberal political order. But I want to now move on to some other obligations which are not covered by Hobbes's principle. And this is where I introduced a neologism of my own, oikophilia, which all Greek scholars here will know means the love of home or love of the oikos. I think of this as a specific range of human emotions which are all of which are absolutely essential to our proper settlement here on earth and to our proper relations with others, even though they cannot be reduced to any simple contract or agreement between us. I remind you of the story of Odysseus in the Odyssey. Odysseus, who represented, if you like, a kind of ideal of a canny and competent Greek who had in his bones the rooted values of the society of that time. He finds himself, in his wanderings back from the from the Trojan War, on an island which he shares with a goddess who had rescued him, Calypso, and he gives up life with the goddess and immortality, which she had offered him, in order to sail across dangerous seas back to his oikos, the home, which he finds invaded by alien forces which are trying to expropriate him. And this story of this attachment which causes him to give up everything that you think he might have hoped for, everything that human beings seem to hope for in other stories like eternal life and relations of a clearly erotic kind with a goddess. You know, most people would think, oh, no, what more do you want? What he wanted was what he had lost, what he had once had, but which defined the place that it was his, and the soul that was his that had grown in that place. Now, I think this is a very moving story. Everybody, of course, loves this story who's read it, but I think it says something about what we are, that all of us actually begin from an attachment to this world, and through many attachments, but these attachments remain with us even though we free ourselves from them. And the psychologists have done quite a lot of research on this process of attachment, but again, I think the real authority on this, as on so many other things, is Hegel, who points out in his philosophy of right and in the phenomenology of spirit that we human beings become free. We become these creatures that we are, who are capable of living through our own free choices, only through a process which attaches us to the world. We're attached to family, to place, to origins, to neighborhood, and then we become free through those attachments, through defining ourselves against them and entering into conflict with them, freeing ourselves from them, but retaining them in some deeper part of our being. And eventually coming in our maturity, coming back to them, reaffirming them, but knowing them for the first time. That process, of attachment, separation, and reattachment in self-conscious awareness, that process Hegel saw in the whole of human life, and I think he was right. We all of us go through this in small corners of our life, and also in the great scheme of our life. And much of our art and literature is devoted to showing this. Now, the attachment isn't only to parents, brothers and sisters and others that we find in the home. The love of home is also the love of a neighborhood and all the things, the customs and the eccentricities which have implanted the image of that home in your memory. And neighbors are extremely important. We have obligations to neighbors, and for us, neighbors are the people in our vicinity. The Anglo-Saxon word, it means those who build nearby, the nearby builders. It comes from the idea that when you imagine a community settling, the first thing that it does is that it builds a home for itself. And if you see that somebody is building a home for himself in the next field, then he is the person who is your neighbor. But famously, the Jewish law, laid down in Leviticus but reaffirmed by Christ in a most emphatic way, tells us that we must love God entirely and love our neighbor as ourselves. And that led to the question when he said this, who is my neighbor? I think it was a lawyer who asked this question. And Jesus replied with the famous story of the Good Samaritan. Now, there's many interpretations of that story. Some people say that what he was saying is that anybody is your neighbor, regardless of any relation of obligation between you. Whoever fulfills the elementary standard of being a human being, he is the person who has a claim on you, and who demands your love in the way that the commandment exhorts you. But of course, I think most people would say that that's not a possible commandment to obey. I can't love everyone. To love my neighbor as myself? That's fine if it's my parents and my sisters and so on. Okay, I can feel love for the guys next door and in a way for my community, but it dwindles as it stretches out across the infinite sea of misery out there. And so the obligation, if made so universal, becomes almost impossible to act upon. There's another interpretation, however, which is this, that the person who came across the Samaritan who came across the wounded victim of this robbery, is somebody who's responding to another's need, somebody who is there, comes there before him, and who is already in a personal relation with him by that very fact. The wounded, robbed person is a you to the eye of the Samaritan, and the I-you relationship has been struck up between them. The Levite and the priest who walked by on the other side of the road were avoiding that relation. They were avoiding putting themselves into the condition of mutual obligation, which the Samaritan the Samaritan opened himself to. So that maybe that's more to the point, that our neighbour is the one who is in that relation to us, and whom we can help or exhibit some kind of love to, which he stands in need of. And that suggests that this oikophilia, which I'm referring to, is a motive that we all feel, and has to do with being proximate to each other. And out of it comes our sense of place, our sense of duty towards those who are in our place, and the obligations of hospitality that come in a society of strangers. When you invite people into your home and so on, these are ways of obeying that second commandment, precisely because these are ways of showing that you are sharing a territory with those whom you are benefiting. And I think I would like to say that this motive, which I call oikophilia, is the one that we ought to call upon when we ask these questions about our obligations to the environment. I think if you look at the literature on environmental philosophy, and also the literature on animals, much of which originated here in Princeton, you will find analytical philosophers often beating about the bush, trying to find some principle whereby we can extend our moral concepts to the difficult problems of environmental protection and the protection of animals. And often people say, well, look, the answer is to assign rights to animals. Animals have rights, and that's why we can't treat them just as we want. And then you end up, of course, saying that the environment has rights. Trees have rights. And at a certain point, this becomes so artificial that, in my view, one should cease to argue in that way and look for a different foundation for duties than the concept of the right. If you say that something has a right, you are bringing it into what I call the calculus of rights and duties. You're supposing that it can relate to you in a certain way through that negotiation of the boundary between you that we relate to each other through. But animals can't do that. So assigning rights to them is imposing upon them a kind of obligation to enter into a relation with us that they can't actually achieve. Obviously, if a cat has a right to be treated properly, we'd naturally expect it to obey its duty to do the same to the mouse. But it doesn't have any conception of duty and is not doing wrong in doing what it does. But we have a duty to look after whatever cat we've taken into our territory, because that is a duty that comes from this natural sense of oikophilia, the sense that we're sharing something and creating out of that sharing an obligation to make sure that things within our environment are properly looked after. And I think that is also the way in which we should see the protection of the environment, something that begins from our own territory and stretches outwards from it. And any attempt to apply rules of environmental protection that don't engage with that motive will just leave people cold, as we've seen, in fact. So what we're doing here is searching for a motive in these cases where obligation cannot be grounded in Hobbes's principle, the principle that obligations lie on you because you yourself have undertaken them. But this leads me to another area which I find extremely difficult, because it's one in which some people enter and some people either fear to enter or refuse to enter, the area of spiritual and aesthetic values. We, again, in our communities, we believe that in the context in which we exist, where political order is founded upon the secular state and we ourselves can choose our laws, that in that condition, religious freedom seems to be a very natural part of the political order. We can grant it to each other, and perhaps we must grant it to each other if we're not to collapse in the kind of religious wars that destroyed Europe in the 17th century, from which, of course, people fled to this country in order to start them all up all over again in a nicer environment. But we got through it, and you got through it, but as you know, in the Middle East today, people have not got through it, and Christians in particular are suffering severely for it, and Jews have already suffered severely too. So, in the secular state, all this religion seems to be, as it were, kept under wraps, pushed into the family, kept into locked into the suburb, and put neatly out of the way. But people are not like that, of course. All religions involve not just being nice to each other or joining in the community of worshippers. They also involve radical commitments. And all of us have, and I said this in the first talk, all of us have this longing not to be me. Being me, being an individual, taking on responsibility for my life, living by my free choices, this is hard. It creates a burden of guilt and a sense that somehow I've overstepped the mark. It's hubristic to be me and to live by free choice. So I have a longing, as it were, to give up, to give myself completely. We all experience this longing, of course, when falling in love. That's what it is, a longing to give yourself completely to another. But that other is a nice, neat, fallible being like you. So it's not such a problem. After the first year or so, you get to realize what a mistake it was. But in the case of, but then you're still in the same situation of having this longing. This longing to give yourself completely and it be resolved forever. That is a deeper thing which keeps coming. We can see in every period of human history. And it's what I call the order of sacrifice that we're encountering in this. The order the order in which we live in many aspects of our world, in which we can't explain what we do in terms of contracts and agreements. We can't explain it in terms of our political obedience. There is something else working on us, a desire to live through absolutes and to give ourselves completely. This is a potential threat to the political order because it's not content with negotiated solutions. And so we need a solution to sacrifice, this desire to sacrifice. We need something that will calm it down. And that, I think, is what we have managed to find in the Judeo-Christian tradition, at least. For us, sacrifice is incomplete without forgiveness. We have an obligation to forgive, and that means that our sacrifices, in the end, will be sacrifices of ourselves and don't involve the murder and mayhem that we've been seeing recently, not only in the Middle East but also in Europe and here. In Boston and so on. So this order of sacrifice is there, and I think it's something which is dangerous, but we have been taught that we must forgive, and we have an obligation to forgive. This doesn't come from any contract, it doesn't come from anything that we've undertaken. It lies there in the nature of things, and it's what is necessary, I think, if we are to live in the easygoing way that we hope for. But it does suggest that all human beings have a need for sacred things, a need for something which, as it were, cannot be spoiled, something which must be treasured and which has an absolute authority. And all our institutions in which our membership is a real value, all these institutions in which membership is presupposed and rehearsed, are as a result of this endowed with a certain aura. We are naturally beings that live in a sanctified or consecrated world. We don't necessarily put it in that way, but we feel it whenever we encounter something which is calling upon us to be more than just the self-centered contract-making thing that we are in day-to-day life. For instance, all these things that are associated with your national membership, the flag, the oath, the parade, and so on. People, ordinary people at least, not obviously Princeton intellectuals, but ordinary people, when observing such a thing, their hair prickles and they stand to attention. Maybe their eyes water and so on. This is a recognition that they're in the presence of something that cannot be spoiled, that is greater than them and of which they are a part. And I think this is something we feel also through our sense of beauty, which endows the whole world with an aura, or can do. But as with everything, there is always the principle of the negative, and this sense of beauty provokes a desire to desecrate, which I think is something which we have seen. And I want to finish just with an area in which desecration has become normal. That's sex. If you end a series of lectures on this topic, people will feel you've given them the complete account. Now, my view is that, and I think it's a view which many people share, is that sexual relations are inherently problematic. Foucault, in his 3-volume Histoire de la sexualité, says that sexual feelings are inherently problematized, meaning that power relations between people impose a kind of problematic order or problematic structure on our sexual relations. But if we took those power relations away, those relations of domination and subjection and so on, the problems would go. His own life doesn't suggest that is true, but nevertheless, some people believe this, and this, of course, is part of the liberationist philosophy which he was, in the end, defending. But my own view is that sexual relations are inherently problematic because this is the area in which the I-you encounter is absolutely essential, but also most easily displaced. All societies, therefore, have attempted to deal with it by, in the past, by strict rules. And the anthropologists in the 19th century, travelling, all of them, not quite all of them, but all of them except Margaret Mead, travelled the world and discovered that indeed all human beings see their sexual relations in terms of an ethic of pollution and taboo. Certain relations are taboo, certain things can't be touched and can't be done, and if you do them, then you're polluted in some way. And we still retain the idea of a dirty way of behaving and so on. But as you know, America went through this extraordinary experience, typified by the Kinsey reports and so on, in which it was represented that sex is actually only about pleasure in the private parts, and it's up to you how you achieve that pleasure. You know, all human beings are free to treat each other as the instruments for obtaining this pleasure, but that's essentially what they're doing. In other words, sex is an instrumentalized way of treating people. You treat people as a means to the end of your pleasure, and perhaps their pleasure too, but nevertheless, it's still a way in which human beings become means to an end. But I think neither of those approaches can really answer for us modern people the crucial question, which is, why is rape so bad? You know, of course, we do lots of things to others which they haven't consented to. You know, I might just love spitting on people, and if I do this to you, you know, you might indignantly wipe away the result, and I might indeed apologise, saying, "Look, I'm sorry, that's where I get my thrills. I didn't mean it," and it's all right. You know, maybe I'd have to pay a little fine or something, but. If the Kinsey sort of view of these things is right, rape is no worse than that. It's doing something to someone without their consent, which is a bit disgusting, but you get over it. But of course, you know that rape is not like that. It's an existential assault. It's actually taking from someone not just a stolen pleasure, but something that she really is, and in doing so, polluting her being, polluting that in her which is most precious. What is most precious? Well, it's the desire to give the whole self to the person you love, or even just to the person you desire, but nevertheless to do it as a gift from you or from me to you. So it's an invasion of that precious thing, that the I to you relation, by a completely different kind of relation, which seems to us to pollute it. And one way of expressing this is to say that it's an invasion of the subject by the object, that we relate to each other as subjects, as I'm an I and you an I, but if we can treat each other as objects, and to treat each other as objects in this particular context is essentially to negate the possibility of the gift which lies at the heart of sexual desire. So it's like stealing what must be given if it is to exist at all. And I think, therefore, we make sense of sexual transactions in a completely different way from the way in which we make sense of ordinary exchanges. It's not like a contractual deal, and the stealing that goes on is not like just stealing the sweets that don't belong to you or anything like that. It is a violation of the self of the other, and that's how we experience it. And it's why we think that rape is a crime almost as serious as murder, but not quite. And I think you can see this by contrasting desire and hunger. Suppose imagine we're all hungry, and suppose the only thing to eat is human beings. Right? There's nothing else to eat in the world, but when eaten, a human being immediately doesn't feel any pain, but immediately is restored. So it doesn't damage anyone to be eaten. So we go around eating each other, and of course it's embarrassing, and a certain amount of consent is necessary first. You might have a long-term partner, just to make sure that you don't impinge on others. But it wouldn't be something that deeply compromises you or deeply compromises her, that you've happened to have snatched a meal without her noticing. But desire is not like that. It compromises you and her immediately in the very act of it. Even though it involves no pain, no observable repercussions except those that exist in the soul of the individual. What I'm saying is that in the case of desire, you're desiring a person, not his flesh. You are desiring him, and he is an incarnate being for you. He comes before you as the individual that he is, and you are in a relation of I to you in the very moment of desire. And that is completely different, of course, from the I to it relation that we have with things or with food and so on. And in the case of the observer, of course, there is a possibility of an even more debased thing, which is the it-to-it relation of body parts. And I don't need to remind you that this is the situation in which we're emerging today with the triumph of pornography, thanks to the Supreme Court in this country, over all the natural ways in which human beings respect each other. What it is doing is changing sex into an observer's activity, in which the things that interest people are body parts, and the sexual relation is seen as an it-to-it relation and not an I-to-you relation. All those old-fashioned virtues that seem to belong to prudes only, like modesty, embarrassment, courtship, and so on, actually were necessary to maintain the I-to-you relation in being at the very moment in which you gave way to each other. And so I think this is a very good illustration of the way in which this area can only be understood in terms of that metaphysics that I gave in the first talk, and it helps us to understand why these obligations are so different why the obligations here are so very different from obligations elsewhere in human life. That's it. Thank you.
The floor is open for questions. You want to recognize?
Yes, good questions.
Recognize them. The floor is open.
You better.
We start with students.
Students.
Sorry, right. We always start with a student question first, or student question. So, any students, undergraduate, graduate? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
In the three forms of political allegiance you outlined, citizenship, kinship, and there's the third one. Of course territorial loyalty.
Yeah.
Is territorial loyalty the most logical extrapolation of oikophilia? Of that obligation, is that the most natural as opposed to kinship? Or?
I would say yes. That this is our experience, especially in Western societies, that we build up our loyalty from our sense of home and from our sense of ownership of the whole country. And the beauty of the country is incredibly important. As you know, in America, it's part of the whole national myth that it's the beauty of America that's being protected, not just by environmental activity, but also by all forms of diplomacy and all fighting and so on.
More student questions. I see one. Go ahead.
Are we good?
Yeah, carry on.
Well, thank you for your lecture. I also have two questions related to the oikophilia. How are we supposed to understand the type of natural attachments to home within either a European context or an American context? Whenever the past 50 years, we see a much more transient people, the extent to which myself or my father stayed within the land that he grew up in or was born in is much less likely than my grandfather and my great-grandfather. And secondarily, concerning this attachment to home, it seems to also presuppose that there are innate differences between our homes. And this type of regionalism or diverse communities kind of enhance these attachments. And I wonder whether or not you can speak to the fact that, as our country becomes more urbanized or homogenized and communities look more and more similar, what does this mean for attachments to home or the type of territorial loyalty you can see?
I think that's a very good question, and it does bear very heavily on the real political problems of the world in which we live. We have grown up with this territorial conception of loyalty. That's what enables us to think that the law of America has our complete obedience, because this is our country and we're in the business of living here, embellishing it, defending it, and so on. If of course there is just universal migration everywhere, that won't be sustainable. And that's why, in the long run, you might see that Islamic law becomes much more popular, because it doesn't depend upon territory. It depends only on obedience. You just, if you're a Muslim, then it's the same law everywhere. That's the idea, anyway. But most people in this room, I'm sure, would say, gosh, we don't want that to happen. With it will go all our freedoms, and also our sense of being able to live as we do here. Just engaging in conversations with strangers, recognizing shared concerns without having to commit to a single worldview. So what you're referring to is a danger rather than something that we should welcome. And I think this is something that the environmental movement has to take on board too. And it's happening in Europe that people are waking up to this problem, that they can't simply hold on to their traditional allegiance and the rule of law if there is not a country that is theirs. And I think that's one reason why the European Union has become so unpopular.
Betsy, there's a question 2 rows behind you.
So I'm hesitant to ask this question because I think it addressed the least fun part of your lecture, but I can't get over it. So my question is, if the reason that my cat doesn't have rights is because it can't enter into this kind of negotiation with me, does it mean that my infant doesn't have rights because it can't enter into a negotiation? I imagine you're not saying that, because that comes really close to this idea that only rational beings could have rights, but maybe you are saying that. And if you're not, is it the case that relationship constitutes more of a moral obligation rather than a right that the infant would have?
Well, that's a very important question. And I've thought about this a lot. And I take the view that while the cat is not the kind of thing that can engage in this mutual dialogue of rights and duties, the infant is that kind of thing. He's growing into it, of course, and he grows into it through the bond of love with the mother, who awakens in him by degrees this sense of the otherness of the other. Cats, I don't want to speak ill of cats, because I know if you do, it's always trouble, where someone in the room is going to... But cats do have that kind of solitary apartness, and their conception of the other is of a completely different kind. It's not of another like me, but of something which is potentially edible or not edible. And so we have to deal with them from those premises. It doesn't follow, what I'm trying to say is, it doesn't follow from that we have no obligations to them, especially if we take animals into our own possession and make them dependent upon ourselves, as we do, obviously, with cats and dogs, then that creates an obligation. Because we have deprived them of their ability to live from their own resources, for our own pleasure. So, of course, there's an obligation on us, and that is an obligation of oikophilia. They're in our space, they're in our home. So we've got to look after them as they would require.
Let's open up the floor. Jim. Yes, right. I think Rabbi has hand up first.
Yeah, I'm sorry I missed your lecture on rights, but clearly I've gathered from what you've said that you don't think that rights and duties are correlative all the way down, that there are clearly duties that are not backed up by rights.
Yeah, exactly.
But you also mentioned the Judeo-Christian tradition. Let's take the example of the environment. Most of us would think we have a duty to treat the environment well, to care for the earth, if you will. And does it have a right? Does it make a claim upon us? Well, no. But doesn't the creator of the environment, of the world, have a claim upon us? And isn't certainly the biblical teaching that we are basically guests in God's world, and that we're expected to treat our fellow guests, whom we can interact with, our human fellow guests, properly, and we're also not to basically mess up the furniture. The environment, the context in which this is conducted. So therefore, no, the environment doesn't have a claim upon us, but the environment's creator has a claim upon us. And therefore, I think that the whole difference in terms of treating questions of the environment is if you regard the world out there as ens creatum or not. Makes a fundamental difference in terms of the way we relate to it. And I think that we can preserve the correlation of rights and duties if it's understood that we are in a world of a all-powerful, all-beneficent creator.
Well, there are two responses to that. First of all, that it presupposes a metaphysical belief that may or may not be true. And I would like my exposition of the fundamental moral order to be acceptable to people who don't accept that belief. Okay, so, but you're absolutely right. Of course, all this looks very different if we accept the idea of the benevolent creator to whom we owe our own lives anyway. But the second thing is, I think you're not really talking about a right on God's part. You're talking about a duty of trusteeship that he, or guardianship, that he has imposed upon us. And, well, let me finish. I regard us as under a duty of trusteeship, definitely. But I don't think that there is any particular person who has a right that we should fulfill that duty. This is a duty that lies upon us as the beings that we are.
Philip S. has been very patient. And we'll come back over.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to something that you mentioned. In fact, it was in your outline in your first lecture that you didn't get to, that you said you would, but haven't, and that was the dark side of sacrifice, with reference to the work of René Girard. I wonder if you have thoughts about that that you wish to share with us.
Well, yeah. René Girard has the view that human communities become this kind of negotiated totality that I've been talking about only by passing through a stage of what he calls mimetic desire, in which people compete for their assets, compete to control each other, and engage in cycles of revenge by way of asserting their domination over each other, and that the only way out of this this is part of becoming a self-conscious individual, the only way out of this, for us, without destroying the whole society, is for them to choose a victim who can be sacrificed. Then all their desire for revenge is, as it were, brought to bear on that innocent victim, the scapegoat, who then bears the vengeance of the whole community on its shoulders and takes that burden off into the wilderness or whatever, or is burnt at the stake, and so on. And Girard says this is the origin of our sense of the sacred, which is a very strange thing to say, that when we kill an innocent person in this way, that innocent person becomes sacred to us, because it's only in his death that we recognize that he was innocent in a way that none of us are. He's innocent because it's our sins, our vengeance that's called forth this death, nothing that he's done. He's chosen usually, like Oedipus, because he's outside the community. He's a king, or he's committed incest, or something like that. In his case, both of those. And as a result, we are purged by his death, and we can come together again as a community, and his holiness or sacredness is a kind of reflection of this relief that we feel, that we've at last solved the problem. Now, and he goes on from there to say, there was one sacrificial victim, however, who acknowledged this motive, knew that was what was happening, and forgave. He said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And that changed the world. Okay, so this is a very radical Christian view of what sacrifice is. All this is extremely fascinating, and I didn't talk about it because, as you can see, I've only been able to fit it in now because you've asked about it. I don't think it's all true. I mean, I think there's some truth there, that there is that underlying all human communities. I call it the order of sacrifice, this desire not only to sacrifice yourself, to throw yourself in completely with something like the Islamists do, but also to find a victim. And certainly you see that in all sorts of ways in which, one example, Princess Diana, she was she was a victim of this public prurience. You know, people were pursuing her everywhere to know who is she screwing, what's she doing now, you know, what kind of a creature is this, and driving this poor woman into a corner until she's killed. And then an altar is set up, and flowers, horrible kitsch stuff thrown everywhere, and a kind of holiness radiates across the British proletariat for 5 minutes. So, you know, and I think that's an example of it, and I think we find that in many communities today. So he's right, there is something deep in us that is animated by this.
Another question maybe from this side.
I'd like to ask you to clarify, and I'd like to comment, first also comment on the issue of why is rape so bad? To me, the only acceptable way of understanding your explanation is that our culture tends to assign the idea of pollution and compromise to those who have been raped, and that this is an unfortunate thing, and that it would be ideal if our culture did not do this. And by the way, I just want to talk about men raping women just for simplicity, although I think the same idea can be stretched to any combination. However, it seemed to me that you were not saying that. It seemed to me that you were saying that there is something essentially polluting and compromising in a woman being raped. And if that's the case, I would respectfully but strenuously and urgently disagree. That is what leads some societies to treat raped women as outcasts, to have them thrown out of their families, to sometimes kill them. There's no reason why there should be any more pollution inherent in being raped than in being punched in the face. And it just struck me that if that's what you're saying, I'd really appreciate your clarifying it.
Yes, well, that's certainly true that, and that if no, the question is, why is rape so bad? Not why is it like being punched in the face? It's obviously something much worse. You're absolutely right that the woman herself is innocent. She is not objectively polluted by it in the sense of being now an outcast and somebody who has lost her status as a woman. On the contrary, the guilty party is the one who did it. And that our law recognizes this. So it's not as though we didn't already agree with you, but the question is, why do we think what he did was so terrible? Why you know, it wouldn't have been so terrible to punch her in the face or to spit on her, although those two were things to which she didn't consent. What is it about this way of treating a woman which is a complete invasion comparable to murder, torture, and all the rest, and, or false imprisonment and so on? And I would say that what I'm saying, to some extent, explains this, because what is being done is something is being taken from a woman, which is not just part of her, but her whole self, something that she has to give completely, and she's being abused in the very essence of her being, and not just in some peripheral part of it. So,
Alicia, you had a question?
From the beginning of your 3 lectures, it was very clear that the IU encounter is very crucial, and that it's the foundation of moral life. And I found a bit remarkable that you didn't mention from the beginning the I-it relationship and the I-it encounters, because I assume you were a bit indebted to Martin Buber for the Ich und Du book that he has written, and for him the I-it relationship is of an equal importance and an equal important part of our human nature, and I think for him is even more important, the I-it relationship, because you cannot know everybody on the planet from face to face. I just would like you to speak a bit more about the I-it relationship, really, and returning to the last thing that you said, because then when it came to sex, you mentioned I-it relationship when the it was the the woman that is objectified. So, for example, in your view, a prostitute would be an it, and if you go to a prostitute, you would have an I-it relationship with her. But I think for Martin Buber, you could have an I-you relationship with a prostitute, even if you would pay her, even if there would be a transaction, as long as you treat her as a human being, and if she would ask your help and you would provide help, then you would be in an I-you relationship. Would you agree with him or not?
Well, I'm not familiar with Martin Buber's relations with prostitutes, but my own feeling is that he might be right. That of course you can pay someone for sex, and it's a consensual relation, and still be in some kind of I-you relationship with them, of course. I think my own feeling is actually that Buber is less clear than Kant on this issue. Kant says that, of course, we treat each other as means, but it should never be the case that we treat each other as means only, or in other words, as things only. All these sexual transactions have an element of treating the other as a thing, but the ideal, of course, is for all that to be completely overcome by total unity of self and self. But I think there are all kinds of intermediates. The I-it relation, it's true I didn't talk about it earlier. I wonder why. Probably because I was trying to talk about the I-you relation and make that absolutely fundamental. I think there are other relations that we have with the world. I haven't really talked very much about the I-we relation. I touched on it in talking about political order and the we relation, etc. So there's lots of different things that can be talked about here, and I guess the problem, to going back to the lady's question, she's now fled, but a question about animals, that this comes to the fore. With some animals, we do have an I-it relation, and constantly, because they're so like us, the I-you relation takes over, and we enter an ambiguous area, especially at the moment when you finally do take it to the slaughterhouse. That's the crucial moment in my experience, which doesn't occur with most marriages.
Ashley, you've been very close. I mean, if you still want to ask your question.
Thank you for remembering I had my hand up. I really have appreciated all of your lectures, and I've learned so much from them. I had a question because I think I might have misunderstood you in your interpretation of the Good Samaritan, because it seems like a critical difference is that the Good Samaritan puts himself in the way of the man who's injured, whereas the two other characters deliberately put themselves out of the way. But part of Jesus' point is that all three of them had an obligation that they didn't undertake.
Yeah.
So how would you explain that? Is it then the obligation is that the other two people should have put themselves on the same side of the road as the Samaritan instead of avoiding it? Or what would you say?
Well, it's just a very... Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. That I haven't really presented the Christ's dialectic quite as I should have done. And it is clear that the priest and the Levite deliberately, as it were, ignore this man. And we all of us know this, that we do this. We hear somebody crying out for help somewhere in the busy street, and we think, oh gosh, no, let's not get involved. And there are degrees of culpability. If the Samaritan coming across the person lying in front of him, injured and moaning and so on, had then just stepped over him, that would be even more culpable than those who just thought, I don't have anything to do with this. But the real problem here is that out there, there is this infinite sea of misery. Which bit of it is mine to deal with? That's the real question we all of us have to answer. We can't go in saying it's all for me to deal with, because I couldn't. That's another way of giving oneself an excuse. And Dickens has the beautiful example in which is it? Is it Hard Times? Not Hard Times. Mrs. Jellyby. Bleak House, who devotes all her charitable attention to the poor and the starving in Borrioboola Gha, and her children are neglected around her and going to pieces. And she does this not, of course, because she really wants to help those people, but precisely because this way she gets out of the real duties and represents herself as a hero of compassion. Without the trouble of having to do anything. And I think that we're all tempted by that too, to make our duties universal precisely so that they cannot be acted upon. So we all of us therefore need a concept of the responsibilities diminishing away from us, and the things that we must act upon are those things which directly appeal to us when the you comes before us.
We have one clock that says it's a minute after 6 and one clock that says it's a minute before, so I think I'll declare it 6 and apologize to those of you with questions remaining, but I would like to invite all of you to a reception. The reception is on the side over here immediately after, and perhaps we can pepper Dr. Scruton with a few last questions, but before that, please join me in thanking him for a marvelous speech.
Thank you very much.